Ballerina Farm is back in the news, this time because of raw milk. And I knew this video was coming someday, but I did think it was going to be because they actually put somebody in the hospital with the raw milk. So credit where it's due. I want to shout out the state of Utah for telling wealthy, powerful people, no, that's the kind of basic get her done that's been missing in this country for a while now, so it's always nice to see it. The best source for this looks to be KPCW, so shout out to public radio for doing some real reporting here. It says, according to records obtained by KPCW from the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food, health inspectors found 2 health violations during milk testing in summer 2025. Tests from late May and early June revealed 2 high levels of coliform, the family of bacteria that includes E. coli, in the farm's bottled raw milk. The state's dairy program manager told KPCW that Ballerina Farm then made the decision to pause raw milk sales. So this decision looks like it was made actually back in August. They got their bad test results in May and June and then stopped selling milk in August. But then it hit the news in February of 2026. The timing, where the bad test results were in May and June, and then Ballerina Farm stopped selling raw milk in August of 2025. There's a story there. How Utah's raw milk law works. We're going to get into that. And once it hits the news in February 2026, Ballerina Farm starts, quote, clapping back, is how I saw it described once, by releasing information that I would personally describe as not true. Everything in here is my opinion. So it's an informed opinion as someone who's done a lot of farming and food safety in my life. But I don't know these people, I don't know their farms. Now, to understand how a farm can release information that is not true and kind of be given a pass for it, you have to know something about milk and milk quality and how that's measured and how we do the testing. So to get into what Ballerina Farm did, we're going to have to do a little deep dive on dairy quality. So let's get into it. Okay, so what exactly happened with Ballerina Farms and their raw milk? Well, to sell raw milk legally in the state of Utah, there's a couple different ways to do it. You can either just be super small, you sell your milk only through herd share, or you sell less than 120 gallons a month. That might be what Ballerina Farm was doing before early 2025. And once you start selling more raw milk in the state of Utah, there's a few more boxes you have to check, because now if you do it wrong, you can make a lot of people sick. So they just have some higher expectations of you being on top of things. What you have to do once you hit that larger size is you can only sell through your own store. It can be either on the farm, it can be off the farm, it can even be a food truck that you're selling, but you can't sell it through another grocery store. It has to be directly from you. So we saw Ballerina Farm open this new farm stand. That might be part of it. The other thing you got to do is get your raw milk tested once a month by the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. They're going to send a health inspector out. They're going to take some milk samples, take them back to the lab, see what's in there. Now that's just a monthly spot check. I think people have this idea that if you test something, then you know what's in there. That's not strictly 100% true. Testing doesn't always catch every single problem in there, so you can be flagged clean at the lab and still make people sick. However, if the lab is catching problems, then you do have problems. So that is in fact what happened. It said tests from late May and early June revealed 2 high levels of coliform. It's the family of bacteria that includes E. coli in the farm's bottled milk. So Utah has some standards when they test your milk. So, you can have this many bacteria total, and sometimes those can be lactobacilli. Those are normal, harmless skin bacteria. They can live on the udder. Those are harmless, so we don't worry too much about those. But when it comes to things like coliform, those bacteria are called coliform because they like living in butts. They like it when it's body temperature. They like it when there's a lot of nutrients around. They can gobble up really quick. And yeah, they really like colons. When you're having a lot of coliform show up in your raw milk, I can tell you one of 2 things, right? That can tell you the outside of the udder is pretty poopy and you didn't clean it enough before you milked the cow, which is a problem. The other thing it could tell you is you have a coliform infection going on inside the cow's udder. It's already in the milk. You can't clean the udder enough to get it off because there's an active infection of these coliform bacteria going on in the udder. Because what do coliform bacteria like? They like body temperature. They like a lot of nutrients. What do you think the inside of an udder is like? Milk is supposed to be food. It's a lot of really simple nutrients that are easy for a calf to break down, which means it's also easy for bacteria to break down. It is an ideal incubator for poop bacteria in there. The fact that Ballerina Farm got flagged for coliform twice in a row in May and June, basically right after they started producing raw milk, that's a problem. Because at that point, it's not just a milk safety problem, you're also looking at a herd health problem. For coliforms, the limit is 20. To get to 20 CFUs per mil of coliform bacteria, that tells you probably have multiple cows in your herd having coliform in the milk. They either have poopy udders while they're being milked, or they have an active coliform infection going on inside their udder. That is a serious case of mastitis. For any people out there who may have experienced mastitis, that's when your mammary gland gets infected. It hurts. It is painful. It sucks. It's very normal for every cow and every person who is lactating to have mastitis a couple times. But if you have enough animals with that happening to get flagged for coliform twice in a row, when you just start producing, you're coming up red for coliform. There start being questions to me about how are we taking care of those animals? What is happening with these cows that they keep getting poop in their udders that bad? Okay. Okay, so now we have a question, because according to the state of Utah's records, Ballerina Farm failed 2 tests, but according to Ballerina Farm, it passed the state's required testing. Well, that's a bit of a disconnect. So what's going on here? Well, in the state of Utah, if you sell raw milk, you are allowed to fail your state tests twice. If you hit 3 in a 5-month period, that's when you are no longer, quote, passing state testing. So Ballerina Farm was, in fact, failing multiple tests. You're just allowed to fail multiple tests until you fail too many, and that's when they cut you off. So when I say they're putting out statements and press releases that I would describe as misleading, yeah, I would say they did not pass the state's required testing. You're just allowed to fail a certain number of times. They also make a few more statements in here that I just want to point out for the wiggle word of it all. Things like Ballerina Farm never recalled any of its product, including raw milk. That's not true either. They pulled milk that they had already put on the shelves off the shelves. That's a recall. They only had to do the recall in their own store, but that's still a recall. You made a product that then had to be taken off the shelves. That's what a recall is. Raw milk that did not meet regulatory or industry standards was not sold and responsibly disposed of. It's pretty common for farms that are selling a product that is high risk, like sprouts, raw milk, to test their product. So back when I was doing food safety consulting, I had clients who were growing leafy greens. There's been a lot of outbreaks with leafy greens, and they didn't want to have one at their place. So a lot of farms that sell something high risk, like raw milk, leafy greens, sprouts, will do extra testing. There's once a month, the health department comes and takes a sample, but you're also doing extra tests of your own every week or every day, so you have more information. You find out there's a problem as soon as it starts and get on top of it. So it sounds like Ballerina Farm was doing this additional testing to stay on top of things, which is very good of them, and it looks like they were getting enough positives that they were having to throw away a decent amount of milk. They mentioned economic considerations. It kind of sounds like they might have been having to throw away enough of their product that it wasn't really quite penciling out anymore, which is a thing that can happen. It stops being a good business if you have to throw away a lot of your product, and so it sounds like that was involved. So I did a video a few months back on Ballerina Farm and their journey with beef cattle, that journey to raising good quality beef, and how in a lot of ways it kind of sounds like they might still be on it. So if you want to see that, that's going to be up here in a corner somewhere. For now, what I want to point out is that dairy is a lot more complicated than beef. And when you're doing raw dairy, that's even more complicated than normal dairy. Let's talk about why that is and how that can maybe help us explain why Ballerina Farm had a discouraging experience with raw dairy here. In general, dairy is just a lot harder than beef. Why is that? Well, to turn a cow into beef, you only have to do that once. To get dairy out of a cow, you got to do that once or twice or 3 times a day, every single day. To get beef out of a cow is an event that happens one time, and you can delegate that to someone else. There's a slaughterhouse that does that for you. You can just send them off to the slaughterhouse. When it's a dairy farm that you own, you're in charge of running that thing. Even if you're hiring other people, you have to hire a competent person to do it. You have to get a contractor to build the thing that builds it right. You have to write the checks and buy the right equipment and tools to get the thing to work properly. And it sounds like that is kind of where things fell down for Ballerina Farm. It sounds like this raw dairy thing might be the first commercial farm thing that the Needlemans actually tried to run themselves. Even if it's animals raised on their farm, they're sending it off to a slaughterhouse, to somebody else to deal with all that food safety, to deal with the logistics of killing animals. It's difficult. And packing them up and keeping them labeled and weighed and keeping everything in order, they're letting somebody else handle that. If you're getting things like baked goods and frozen bread dough from their website, someone else made that for them too. Hannah Needleman is not in her kitchen kneading commercial bread dough to mail out to people. That's not what's happening there. To start your personal farm journey with raw dairy is kind of like, I want to be a car mechanic, so I'm going to start by building a Formula One race car from scratch, and I'm actually going to put it in a race and expect it not to explode. Very ambitious, I'll say that. Now here's the part where we talk about this is not just a point and laugh at Ballerina Farm problem. This is actually a very common situation for first-time farmers to find themselves in. A lot of people who are new to agriculture, they come into it through the hobby route because they're like, I love putting my hands in the earth. It feels so good to be outside, which is great. That's nice. But it doesn't teach you professionalism. It's great to connect with the earth. But as soon as you start selling things to other people, it's not about you and your relationship with the earth anymore. It's a job. You're making things for other people, so they have to work. And in the case of food, part of what working is not giving people the shits when they eat it. And that transition from this is a hobby, this is a thing I do because I like it and it fulfills me, making that transition to this is a job. There are professional standards that you have to meet, or else that's a very difficult transition. So that this is an important thing to keep in mind, I think, for everybody. The minute you go professional with agriculture or anything else, it is no longer about you and your singular auteur vision. It's about other people. When your relationship to agriculture is defined by what makes you happy, what feels good to you, discipline goes out the window. We kind of have this culture of of wanting to treat agriculture like something that comes from the heart. It's intuitive, it's supposed to be simple, and that is a terrible basis for any job. There's actually a lot of discipline involved in doing anything well. This is not about making me feel good anymore. This is about being accountable to my customers. Anyway, bottom line, this is a very common kind of problem to stumble into for first-time farmers. And I ran into it a lot because I was teaching a lot of first-time farmers. Usually the reason people called me in was food safety, because food safety is when people finally realize, oh, we need to call in someone with more experience to guide us through this. And then once I get there, we're like, actually, there's a lot of things we could work on here. Pest management, just general logistics, how to harvest a crop, how to hire people. I wound up helping clients with all kinds of stuff, but food safety was usually the reason they called me in. And they usually called me in way too late. They'd already built the building. And at that point, there's only so much you can do. If it's a dairy parlor, for example, you may have bought equipment that is very difficult to clean. I had multiple food safety clients who built indoor farms for raising leafy greens, and then for whatever reason, there was no way to drain water off the floor. There was no drain for it to go down. You'd have people walking around at work in like ankle-deep soupy water, and then they call me in to get it food safety certified. Buddy, it's too late. You've got a swamp water pond in your facility. It's never going to be clean. And this feels like what Ballerina Farm ran into. They said, producing raw milk takes careful planning from a facility and infrastructure standpoint. Unfortunately, we learned this after the fact. And boy, does that speak volumes. I think there's really an attitude among people, especially those who are brand new to farming, where they think food safety is just paperwork that you do after the fact. The reality is, food safety is built into your facility. If you have a dairy farm where dairy cows are spending a lot of time standing around in their own poop, they will also lie down in their own poop to chew their cud. And when you're flopped down belly first on a pad of poop, you're gonna get coliforms in your udders, you're gonna get a lot of mastitis, and you're gonna get dirty raw milk. I don't know that that's exactly what happened with Ballerina Farm, but I've definitely seen it happen with other raw milk dairies. I actually did a video on a raw milk dairy just like that earlier this year. Link might pop up around here somewhere. It sounds like it is just straight up not possible to make raw milk that passes those state standards with the setup they've got. Once you've built a dairy farm that way, it cannot be fixed because there is nowhere else for those cows to go but flop down belly first on layers of poop. It's also possible they built the place with lines and pumps and tubing that just don't clean out very well, and so you just have to pasteurize that milk because it passes through something that can't be cleaned very well. So they have finally decided to stop trying, which does reflect a certain level of wisdom. The real MAGA thing to do here would be double down, sue the government, and run for office to change all the laws. So if you see a Neeleman running for office anytime soon, you heard it here first. This is a good time to point out something kind of funny that can happen anytime we're legalizing raw milk or other products that can be quite risky. You'll get advocates who say, we want to legalize this, it should be legal, it's good for you, and they push and they push and they push for it, insisting that it's safe. And because it's so safe, we should have a way to sell this. So what lawmakers will often do is say, you know what, you're right. People are going to buy it anyway, so we might as well do it legal so we can have some oversight, make sure we're doing it right. And we need to have some standards, don't we? And the people who want to sell the product will say, yeah, standards. We know our product is safe and for sure we can meet those. And then they let people loose on these standards. And then the people who work so hard to make a legal process to sell it and agree to all these stringent standards try to meet those standards and realize that it's very, very hard. Once you have a political system where people refuse to be told no when they insist on doing things that their ancestors knew were stupid, telling them yes as long as you meet XYZ is the next best thing, because it gives them a chance to find out how unrealistic this thing they wanted to do might be, and gives them a chance to tire themselves out without hurting anybody. If they manage to clear the bar, that's great. They're making a quality product. And if they find out that it's hard and they have trouble meeting that bar, then that's a really important learning experience. Just because your ancestors did something doesn't mean it's easy. Just because poor people and immigrants can do something like farm doesn't mean it's easy. All right, we gotta wrap this thing up. I want to close this out with an important thought. I've been really hard on Nepo babies in general, and especially in this video. Nepo babies don't have to be useless. Wealthy people learn what failure is and what it can cost you by watching it happen to their friends. Somebody who perhaps grew up in a food handling family has some context for the world that they're in. And this is kind of how dynasties are supposed to work. You're raised in the house of blah, 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 and you grew up learning the craft. It's certainly not universal, but it can happen. So I want to give credit where it is due. I've actually worked with some folks who were born into minor food handling dynasties who turned out to be very good at what they were doing. Actually, one really good experience was working with this guy who was doing his own little startup. They were making pork rinds, but with fish skin, and so it had like healthy fats and stuff in it. They tasted really good. They had some cool flavors like chili lime, but they kind of had a challenge because they were doing a fried product. There's kitchens for hire where if you bring them a recipe, they can make it in bulk for you. These kitchens for hire, if they do fried foods, they don't usually handle seafood ingredients because then you have an allergen problem. And if they do seafood, you don't have a whole lot of seafood handling facilities that have chip frying kettles. So the only kitchen for hire they were able to find that was willing to do both was kind of a fly-by-night operation, the kind of place where you walk in and you're like, is this run by the mob? So one of the things that made this place sketchy was their pay was not very good. So the guy who was trying to get this snack recipe tested out and commercialized, who was hiring this kitchen for hire, he said, I need to give your workers bonuses. They're literally not getting paid enough to care about this the way they need to care about it. So please let me pay your workers more. That was a baller move. This guy knew what was up. He was like, look, they're having a really big case of I am not paid enough to deal with this. I need to pay them enough to deal with this. So that guy was really proactive about doing the right thing. So his experience growing up in the food industry, he learned a lot of positive things from that. At the same time, this family-owned kitchen for hire was super sketchy. So you win some, you lose some. So this is all in the service of just pointing out, just because Ballerina Farm is run by wealthy people does not mean it has to be a failure. You can live with considerable privilege and still pay attention to what's going on around you, still be thoughtful. A lot of people just don't choose to do that. I'm trying to figure out why it is that I think it's important to say that. I think it comes down to sometimes we're almost making wealthy people's excuses for them. Oh, they couldn't know better. They were just born rich and dumb. That's not how this works. Having wealth and leisure and resources in your life, you have the time to learn what you're doing. A lot of people just choose not to use it. We need to expect way more. I feel like I'm supposed to say amen. Anyway, those are some thoughts on raw milk and farming ain't easy.